But he did have a 504 plan, which put in writing that if he, felt like he was going to be ticking a lot in the classroom, that he could sort of raise his hand or signal to the teacher that he had to leave the classroom. And he was, taking advantage of it, just sort of wandering the halls. And we, sat him down and said, look, you have to sort of start working harder. And it is challenging because you don't really want them to use it as an excuse, right? But at the same time, you want to get them the right help that they need.
Welcome to Parent Footprint with Dr. Dan. I'm Dr. Dan. This show is about making the world a more loving, accepting, and compassionate place, one parent, one person, and one child at a time. The key to raising healthy and engaged kids is for parents to seek the same in their own lives while striving to be the best versions of themselves each day. No matter who you are or where you came from, with increased awareness, you can be purposeful about leaving a healthy footprint for your children, your family, and all those you care about, while living your own life to the fullest. Today's show is What Makes Him Tick? Parenting a Child with Tourette Syndrome with Michele Turk. Michele has worked as a journalist for 3 decades, covering parenting, health, and education. She is the author of her new book, What Makes Him Tick? A memoir of parenting a child with Tourette Syndrome, which is a #1 Amazon pre-sale bestseller in the biographies of people with disabilities category. Her articles and essays have appeared in Bloomberg Businessweek, Parents, Parenting, The Hartford Courant, Elle, USA Weekend, The Washington Post, Brain, Child, and Next Avenue. She has served as president of the Connecticut Press Club since 2015. Michele lives with her husband in Fairfield County, Connecticut. Michele, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time because I had the privilege of reviewing your book, your memoir. Seems like a while ago as this process has been unfolding, and I was happy to reacquaint myself with it once again. So I've actually spent a lot of time with your memoir, and I just want to say congratulations for getting to this place.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming.
And when I say getting to this place, I realize there's multiple things here. One, of course, is getting your book out there and published and talking about it, which is a huge milestone. And a other huge milestone is going through this process that you went through with your family and getting out to the other side in a way that not only have you written the book that you wished you had, but you now have a child who has become a young adult who is in life, and you can tell everyone the story of the dips, the highs, the lows, everything, and you guys are in a good place.
We are.
Yeah.
And I think, I started this book really right after Michael was diagnosed. And not really, I didn't start out to write a book. I started out writing in my journal and scribbling notes in paper all over the house, sort of because it seemed so surreal. I wanted to capture what was happening. It made it a little more believable and able to sort of digest it. And then eventually I took a memoir writing class, essay writing class. I already have a journalism degree, but writing about yourself is very different and your family. Mm-hmm. And when I started sharing it with other moms and writers in the group, that's when I realized that I might have a memoir to write. It was writing in real time, a lot of it. Mm-hmm. So that's really where we are. And I do think that I tell people that, when they ask how long have you been writing this, it's been more than a decade since I started scribbling the notes and since Michael was diagnosed, but it's been on my computer for that time. Like I would put it down and pick it up. Months at a time would go by. But really at some point I felt that I realized that there aren't a lot of books out there about Tourette, and I felt that my story and my family's stories was one that really needed to be told. And there's no question that it's a better book, and I think it's more educational and inspirational because so much time has passed and that we
Mm-hmm.
see Michael's changes and all the things we've gone through together as a family and him since he was 11. He'll be 25 in a month.
Yeah. Yeah, the book is, there's so many aspects to the book because, of course, as being the journalist that you are, and the mama bear that you are slash were, um, you were all in. You were all in on talking, trying to understand this disorder, which we will talk about and educate our community with. That is so misunderstood, um, seen as rare relative to many of the other neurodevelopmental issues, and then as you find out over time, is connected to many other neurodevelopmental issues that people just wave off. And as you were going through this process, research and information in the last decade has, it seems there's much more understanding, even though there's a long way to go, of what Tourette is versus when you started this journey when he was 11.
Yes, so much has changed. When Michael was diagnosed, it was 2011, and I immediately contacted the Tourette Association. I was online, searching Google searches every night. I was reading medical studies, just trying to figure out what this is and what it meant. And, we were told, all the literature, everything said at the time that Tourette is a rare condition. And this is actually the only time I want to read a little bit from the book because I don't want to get the numbers wrong. But, for a long time, doctors had definitely been dismissive of kids with tics, like Michael, who ended up having Tourette syndrome. And that was certainly the case for us. So I'm looking at the DSM-5.
Mm-hmm.
It has changed over the years, the DSM and what it said about Tourette. But basically, for a long time, Tourette's didn't really fall into the small box that's in the DSM criteria. So, for example, if you don't have or you didn't have an observable tic that's the same for more than a year, then it didn't count as Tourette syndrome according to the DSM.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really, how it was narrowly defined led to an underrepresentation of Tourette syndrome. And doctors, pediatricians, and so forth, they would strictly interpret the criteria. So that explained why the numbers have sort of shifted upward over the years. So we were told back in 2011, it was 1 in 160 kids in the United States had Tourette syndrome. And then in 2022, there was another big change. The Tourette Association asked the CDC to revisit the prevalence of Tourette, and they looked at newly published review articles and they used meta-analysis and so forth to calculate estimates of Tourette. And to make a long story short, it turns out that it translates to 1 in 50 children have either Tourette syndrome or some type of tic disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more common than once thought.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the past decade, I see people all the time. Just the other day, I was at a museum and a boy who was probably about 12 sat down next to me on a bench. And next thing you know, he's tapping his hand and he was squeaking and making some humming sounds. No question in my mind that it was a tic disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the reasons that it goes unnoticed and underdiagnosed is because some of these things are things that you do every day. Like, who doesn't make a little noise once in a while or tap his or her hand or, blink their eyes? These are everyday occurrences. So people don't really necessarily think that it's a tic disorder.
Mm-hmm. We often get from medical professionals, just keep an eye on it. These things are usually transient, which there is a lot of truth to that. Oftentimes they are transient, and they do come and go, and they increase with stress or um, developmental issues, hormones, puberty. And a lot of times they do just pass on, but there are a lot of times it does not. And as you've learned from these amazing professionals, Dr. Walkup, Mr. Wright, who you talk about in there, just is so
Yes,
wise.
yes.
Um, I'm going to say one thing he said. You have so many wonderful quotes from him that he said, the tick is the calling card to the doctor, but what I'm trying to get you guys to do is not get tick focused. Focus on the whole child and focus on the co-occurring conditions that are associated with real impairment over the lifetime. And so there's a lot in that, right? So first of all, knowing that when our kids are struggling, we're trying to figure out what's wrong and to fix it. So there's that thing we'll talk about. And then there is this whole co-occurring issues of ADHD, OCD, that these things take hold sometimes even more at times than the actual tic or Tourette that initially has led us to go on this hunt.
Right. So back to the original point you made, I just want to agree that it is still true that many, many kids, and it is more boys than girls, have tics that eventually resolve on their own. No question. In Michael's case, that's not what happened. They got worse. And then eventually, when he was 11, it changed from just motor tics like eye blinking and facial grimaces. And, the doctor originally told him it was allergies. I'm
Mm-hmm.
laughing. But,
Yeah.
but then he came home and he did start cursing. So he had coprolalia, and it was pretty severe. So I do think that, I'm not a medical professional, but I do think that anyone who has a child with tics should just, get it checked out. And, the Tourette Association has done an amazing job. Since Michael was diagnosed, there are now 21 centers of excellence all over the country that have multidisciplinary services, everything from family counseling to, the doctors who know about medicine, therapy, and so forth. So it's definitely changing, and there's definitely a lot more resources and help out there for people. Um, when you were talking about Dr. Walkup, that's Dr. John Walkup, who, yes, there's an entire chapter on the book called, I think it's Meeting Mr. Right.
Yeah.
And I went to the Tourette Association's conference in Washington, D.C. in 2012, I believe. And he gave what's called the Newly Diagnosed seminar. It's an all-day seminar. And he's actually doing that again this year. The Tourette Association conference is in Dallas in June. And Dr. Walkup will be doing the Newly Diagnosed. And they usually do put it on their website. So for people who can't go to Dallas, it is available. And it really was incredibly helpful for me. I will actually be speaking there this year.
I was
But
going
we
to
can talk
ask.
about that later. We can
That's
talk about,
wonderful. Right.
yeah, but we can talk about that later. But so basically, what you're referring to is all of the other things. The calling card is that, the way it was explained to me when Michael was diagnosed is that it's a triangle of usually the tics, OCD, and ADHD. But now I think, the image that I see all the time is this iceberg, and the caption Tourette is just the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
And so on the top of the iceberg, the image has vocal tics and motor tics. And then under the water, it's got behavioral issues, anxiety, OCD, depression, handwriting issues. There's more than a dozen different things. And so, I think that's one of the reasons why it can be tricky to treat, because you aren't just treating the tics.
Mm-hmm.
in many cases. In Michael's case, one doctor told us, I'm happy about all the things I'm not seeing, because it was mostly the tics. He's got just enough OCD to make it a positive, really. He's very
Productive, right?
organized, and
Yeah, right.
exactly, and his room is always neat and
Yeah.
things like that. But so that was a blessing. I mean, I remember thinking at the time, that's an interesting thing to say, but I didn't understand.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so it's quite a few. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I know that well over three-quarters of people with Tourette will have at least one other comorbid
Hmm.
condition.
Hmm.
Um, and then, of course, there are many who also have a learning disability. So, in
Right.
addition to the tics.
Right. What we know about neurodiverse individuals, and neurodiversity is there are so many flavors and so many co-occurring blends in all different aspects, and that's why it's so important to look at the whole child, because we know that whether we go through the ADHD lens, which we know that there's so much comorbidity with ADHD, right, or now when we're talking about Tourette or OCD or learning disorders, and if you have a learning disorder, there's often some other processing things going on with that too. So it is sometimes it could feel like that old game whack-a-mole, like what is going on here and what do we target? And then this is that interesting part on your guys' journey and what you came to. It's like we spend so much time, I alluded to this before, we spend so much time trying to solve the identified problem. We often lose sight of the whole entire child and the strengths and these other aspects of them. And this is something for everyone listening, any of us who have been on this road as a parent. It is the first place you go to is not, oh, well, yeah, they're doing all this stuff and they're struggling over here. So we're just going to really focus on his music. It's like, no, no, no. The wheels are coming off over here. Like they're getting teased at school. They don't want to go to school. So tell us a little bit about that journey for you on the solve the problem versus the expanded view of Michael.
Well,
I know it's not a short story.
no, it's not a short story. So early on, I can't count how many doctors we went to and healers we went to, and I dragged him to a lot of different people, and almost everybody said the same thing, and that was, you really need to find something that he enjoys doing. What are his hobbies? What does he like to do? And I didn't really understand why they were asking this question at first. And over time, I realized that, I think one of the most important things, and I was so focused on getting rid of the tics and getting him back to school, and also, trying to figure out the magic bullet, right? That there was something out there that was going to just make him, you know, get better and back to his old self. And so, but we realized very early on, I would say a month after he was diagnosed, that he, when he had taken drum lessons and guitar lessons when he was younger, and he stopped doing that. And then he, we were in a car ride, and he was in the back seat, and we were blaring music, and he started playing drums with his fingers and then singing. And we realized that when he played the drums, the ticking literally almost magically stopped. So we brought in the drum instructor and the guitar instructor again. And then eventually he ended up going to the School of Rock to take music lessons. And it's a performance based program. There's franchises all over the country. And honestly, this is where he found his people. He built self esteem. It was amazing. He's actually a very good musician. He played guitar, drums, he sang. So a year after, to the date, after he came home cursing, he was on stage I forget what, I think he was singing and playing guitar at that point. And they have shows that, sort of each season there's a different band. So he was in Black Sabbath. And he
He's
would
like
go
12.
downstairs.
He's 12 doing Black Sabbath. Yeah.
12 doing Black Sabbath. He would go down to the basement and practice. And, the whole house reverberated with this, wasn't exactly my cup of tea, but it worked for him. And then next thing they're doing Led Zeppelin and Tom Petty and, you name it. He did this for years. He did this through high school. And it was really, an outlet that he needed. He found his people. But also, I think research has shown that when kids with tics do any sort of focused activity, and this is not, so whether for some kids it's sports, the soccer player Tim Howard has said that when he's, in the goal, when he's focused on that, he doesn't tic. So it's that, so for kids with Tourette syndrome, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. The other really engaging part of your story, and again, everyone, what you'll really appreciate is how raw and vulnerable and real that you just put yourself out there with the marital challenges, the personal emotional regulation challenges, right? Like as you say, now that I'm talking to you, you talk about in the book, you're like, I'm actually a very quiet, soft-spoken person. So people would shocked to know that I became a screamer through all of this stress, right? Like the amount of stress that occurs when you have a child in need and you're worried and people don't seem to understand and you feel like it's all on you to fix this. Like words can't even describe what that can turn a person and a family system into.
Absolutely. I mean, we were thrust into crisis, and the crisis went on for a while. I mean, Michael was out of school for 3 months. It was a lot. And, life goes on during the crisis, right? So it's not like my daughter still didn't have to go to Girl Scouts and soccer practice, and my husband went to work every morning. And I had actually started my first have to show up to work job teaching a journalism course an hour and 15 minutes away. And I started a week or so after this happened. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot going on, and we were definitely in crisis, and it does affect the entire family. So on top of, sort of trying to figure out how to solve this problem, I was trying to juggle all these other things. And I think it's important to know that I wasn't somebody who, for whom parenting came naturally. It just wasn't, I had this idea in my mind. I had, big shoes to fill. My mother, there were 4 kids in my family, and my mom was always pretty frazzled, but she kind of was in some ways taught me what, being a good mother was about. There's actually a chapter in the book called The Good Mother about, this was sort of my backstory. This is what I brought to it. So I was hard on myself, and I was very hard on my husband who was, and I do think that's another reason why it's great that I took all this time to publish the book, because, over time I came to appreciate him more and what he did bring to the marriage, and that he was concerned about, paying the bills and so forth. And I was more fixated on helping Michael and taking care of the kids.
Mm-hmm. And you also you highlighted it was really a poignant moment for me, because I think this is at the crux for so many parents who are dealing with a child, again, with any sort of special needs or neurodiversity, is how much do we accommodate and how much do we, I guess, at the same time, push resilience and stepping up. And there was this moment that you talk about where later on in the story where, he just said, you know what? He's got to learn to step up and step into this, regardless of what he
Mhm.
has or what he doesn't have. And I find like that that is true. And yet, being on all sides of this as a parent and as a professional, I know that the balancing act of understanding the situation to help a child grow and give them whatever accommodations and scaffolding they need, while at the same time not making this a crutch or an excuse to not be accountable and show up.
Right. And that's something Dr. Walkup talked a lot about uh, in his lecture, and I talk about in the book, where he said something like, parents, their child is diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, and all of a sudden, all the rules they throw out the door. It's like, whatever you want. And, he jokes and says, and Johnny does whatever he wants. Like he runs, all over the parents. And there was a real balancing act that took time because I was, you know, trying to figure it out, but I was also, and so my husband was the person who stepped in and said, look, you know, it, we can't, he basically more or less said that I was coddling him. And in some ways I was, and I do think that, Michael, and I don't know how much of it was parenting and how much was who this kid was, but he did step up. He never had an IEP because it turns out he doesn't have a learning disability, but he did have a 504 plan, which gave him, put in writing that if he, felt like he was going to be ticking a lot in the classroom, this is when he eventually got back to school, that he could sort of raise his hand or signal to the teacher that he had to leave the classroom. And he was, taking advantage of it, just sort of wandering the halls
Mm-hmm.
and he fell behind in school a lot. And we, sat him down and said, look, this, and you have to sort of start working harder. And so it is challenging because you don't really want them to sort of use it as an excuse, right? But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, you want to get them the right help that they need.
Right. And it is a balancing act. And I think awareness is such a cornerstone of this show. And it's all about awareness, right? Just being aware that this is the dance is really important in of itself. Like, yes, we need to get some help. So for example, it is not enabling to have an accommodation for a child who has significant tics, which will not only distract others in the classroom during a test, but will also distract himself and create more anxiety around the tics. So to take a test in a private room to reduce that and the embarrassment, that the whole social aspect, that is very reasonable. That's not enabling. But at
Mm-hmm.
times it does get to be too much when someone feels like they're not capable, they can't do it on their own. And then it becomes, as you talk about, and the doctors talk about, part of identity, right? We do not want disability to be the main pillar of one's identity, because as you had pointed out, one of the doctors said, if you don't focus on who they are, you know, a large percent of the time the tics will go away or at least be insignificant, not significant in the person's life. And so now they're 18, 19, 20, 24, and they don't know who they are outside of having Tourette.
Exactly. And it's interesting because that's back to the point that I can't stress enough, finding things that they're good at, things that they enjoy doing, things that they can be proud of and build self esteem. So, when they get to a certain age, they're not just, I'm Michael and I have Tourette syndrome, and they don't know who else they are. And in Michael's case, it's almost the other extreme where, this is so far in his past. And fortunately, he was off all medications almost a decade ago. So he was on medications for a short while. He's really been tick free for years. So
Hmm.
he graduated from college in 2021. And I would say in college, he would have, if he had like exams or finals or something stressful going on in his life, um, sometimes he would tick, but it was very minor, just like the eye blinking or grimaces or things like that. And it was things that only his mother noticed. So he
Mm-hmm.
literally, he's sort of the opposite extreme where he's like got all these different things he's interested in. He doesn't define himself. He barely, it's not that he doesn't acknowledge it, but it's just not that much. Even though Tourette is a chronic condition, you always have, he doesn't really, um, definitely doesn't see himself as sort of any sort of poster child for Tourette or anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And who would have thought, like, there's no way, I can say this with confidence, having been in your life for several hours while reading the book. There's no way you, in that moment, were thinking, oh, this will pass. He'll be fine. Right. It's like, right. It's like, and that's part of the like, that's also what you want. You want people to know that as well, right? Like, you have to take it seriously, but we also have to know what you're seeing in the moment. We can't just extrapolate to a terrible future.
And honestly, I am a worrier. I was a worrier. I did inherit that from my parents. They worried like I've never met anybody. And we do worry more about kids with challenges, but no, if you had told me in 2011 that, my son would go off to college and then take off and move to California, I would have laughed in your face.
Mm-hmm.
There was no, we were so, we were holed up at home watching Cake Boss and American Idol and playing Hangman. And, yeah, he did have the school sent a tutor when he was home.
Yep.
But no, there was no way. So yes, I worried so much about what would become of him. But also back then, and I think that that's one of the other things that will be sort of inspirational about reading the book, that it's not that unusual for people with Tourette's to go on and live full normal lives. I mean, you know Billie Eilish has Tourette syndrome.
Yes.
Louis Capaldi has Tourette syndrome. The soccer star I mentioned, Tim Howard, Seth Rogen, Dan Aykroyd. There are people out there. And of course, there are a lot of people who don't admit it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because for whatever reasons. But, and I just named, celebrities that people know. But I do think that, you know, Billy alone, when I read that, I was like, that was,
Mm-hmm.
I think, in 2019. I just think she's incredibly brave and amazing, and I do think that she's helped to raise awareness, which is
Mm-hmm.
which is
Mm-hmm.
great. But no, but if you're a parent whose your child was just diagnosed, no, you're not thinking ahead. You're trying to get through the crisis, and you're worrying what's going to happen. And in 2011, there wasn't nearly as much information out there. I remember reading "There is no cure"
Mm-hmm.
and thinking, "Oh my gosh, what is going to happen to this child?"
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about navigating medicine and um, where you think it, from your experience, where it's useful and what you've learned, since, because medicine, we have a medical society that goes to medicine pretty quickly. And at the same time, so I mean, there's polar. Medicine can be very helpful, and medicine is often too quickly, and people say overprescribed. But there's a balance in this conversation as well.
Definitely. And it's interesting because I feel like with Tourette syndrome, there are kind of two camps. There's definitely, the medical establishment who has prescription medications that are available to people with Tourette. I think it's important to note that none of them, they're all off label. None of them have ever been approved specifically for treating Tourette syndrome, but that's not uncommon, anyway. So early on, we did put him on first was like an ADHD medication. And then I spent a fair amount of time in the book talking about the angst about, moving to other more sort of heavy hitter medications, I call them. But the other camp that I'm seeing is there are a lot of people who are reluctant to try medications, and they're worried about side effects, and they think they don't work. And, I really think that's where finding, an expert, really not just talking to your pediatrician. And in our case, we went to a pretty well-known neurologist in the area who sent us away twice before he came home cursing, and said it's nothing to worry about. So there's that. So I guess, one of the messages is, approach medications with a dose of caution, but don't rule them out entirely, because, what one doctor, our doctor, told us at the time, the doctor who treated him at Yale, he said, the original medication was 10X, which is
hypertensive.
Yes, used for commonly in kids with ADHD, right? Yeah. So it's a lot of kids are taking that medicine, or at least they were at the time. And he wanted to move to a second generation antipsychotic, and I was just beside myself. And he said, you kind of want to break the cycle. And this might be the way to do it. And so again, and the other thing I want to point out with this, this topic is I am not a medical professional. I was a health writer for many years, and I interviewed several top Tourette experts for the book. But anyway, one of them, Dr. King, Robert King at Yale, said symptoms, and we were talking about whether to put, your child on medications. And he said, quote, symptoms aren't just bothersome in the here and now, but they have a cumulative, debilitating effect because kids could be missing out on normal childhood development. You are potentially missing out on irrevocable opportunities to build self-esteem, acquire athletic skills or academic achievements, and develop peer relationships. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really tough one. It was one of the toughest decisions I ever had to make as a parent, was whether to put him on these medications. And, in the end, I do think that they helped, but I also think that the music was huge, the right academic environment. And, if you ask my son, I asked him once, what of all the things helped the most? And he said, Bailey the dog. That's what we call it. We got a puppy the spring after he was diagnosed. And it was really, this unconditional love, this companion. She's still with us. She's 13, and she was kind of a therapy dog for everybody. She still is.
So yes. Yeah. So it speaks to we sometimes refer to as a patchwork quilt approach to, treatment is I think the technical, more the scientific term treatment, but it's really, I often find we have to look beyond the treatment lens. It's what's the whole package. And like you said, so you have a a wonderful dog who turns into a informal therapeutic animal and buddy for him and the family. The school environment is so important in terms of how is he accepted, how does he feel, how much does he get to focus on who he really is, how much does he have to hide, which we know in middle school and high school there's a lot of that goes on. How is um, does he have mentors or any counselors? What's he involved in? Music, art, right? It's the whole package that, in a sense, I want to say heals, but it's really not as much about healing in this outlook. It's about trying to be wholesome and healthy while one is developing.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, you used the word therapy. Michael was we did send him to a therapist early on. He hated it. It just really wasn't what he needed. And so, I think one thing I like to say is that therapy can come in many forms.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and for him, that puppy was definitely therapy. Music was therapeutic. And, there is uh, there's a connection between music and the brain that I am kind of fascinated with. Because, as I said, when he plays music, he magically stopped ticking. Um, but also, so you kind of really want to just find whatever works for you, but it should be like more holistic than just, you can't just put the child on medicine and then
Right.
wait for it to happen. It
Right.
just doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, also we didn't really talk about this, but, and this is something I definitely, a mistake I made, is that I didn't really take care of myself during this time. And so my therapy was, I just ate chocolate every day and had a glass of
Yeah.
wine at the end of the night. And,
Right. Right. Yeah.
um, it, but for me, I think as a writer, it was therapeutic to write all of this, no question. And I was sort of processing it as I was writing.
So going towards what you just said about self-care, because it you did the human thing, right? The human thing is we just cope, right? We just can actually cope with whatever we can to get through. And what is very typical is when there is a child in crisis and then thus often a family in crisis, there's the idea that there is really no time, particularly for the primary parent who's dealing with all of this, because there's no time. And to actually focus on yourself when the house is burning is seeming like the most ridiculous thing to do. But as you look back, that's not what you would be recommending to people.
No, I would not. I would not. Whatever it is, definitely, I would not recommend neglecting yourself and going, you know, and also the other thing I neglected was my marriage.
Mm.
And, we really, there's no question that having a child who's challenged in any way
Mm-hmm.
puts strain on the marriage. And, I joke in the book, but it's true that what we would do, and what we would do is my husband would come home from work and we would have a little date, like a little cocktail together.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever chaos had gone on that day, or, Michael could hear Michael ticking in the other room, we sat down and we were civil to one another. And I joke that, and then at some point, it was a really bad day. Instead of a glass of wine, we had a bourbon, Manhattan, a old fashioned. And I joke, and I'm actually like writing an essay called Bourbon Saved My Marriage,
Mm-hmm.
because we would sit down and we were civil to one another. So I do not recommend completely shutting your husband out. I mean, I kind of took over, and, he's a medical doctor, he's an OBGYN, but I was the one doing a lot of the work. And I kind of resented that he
Mm-hmm.
didn't make time for us when he spent all this time on, his patients who are kind of strangers in some cases. So yeah, that's another thing and also while I'm talking about this, you also don't want to neglect your
Other child.
typical siblings.
Yeah.
So there's only so much time in the day, right? So you're working, you're trying to take care of this child who's suffering, which is the hardest part, of course. You don't know what the solution is. You've got a spouse or partner, and then you've got, my daughter was 9, and it was confusing to us, but imagine what a 9-year-old thinks, and it was frightening to her. So I would try to do, sort of special things with her, and make time to do things alone with her to
Yeah.
to just make sure she didn't.
Yes.
And she didn't. She
Yeah.
really she actually stuck her head in her books and
Mm-hmm.
read her way through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is, we had a show a while back on the topic was well child syndrome. And, the siblings, the quote neurotypical, or the sibling without the significant challenges, whether it's medical, psychological, emotional, or other, it's just something to be aware of growing up in that household. And everything, this isn't about good or bad, because everything impacts us and makes us who we are. If we have a sibling that has significant issues, that does impact who we are. It's just as parents to understand that this is, again, another thing to be aware of when all this attention is going to a child in crisis, to know that there's another child there who also can be in a softer, quieter, slow burning crisis as well.
Right, right. And I think that, it is something parents definitely need to be aware of. I think that, we would just sit down and talk with her and explain what we knew at the time. And because as we were working through it, and, it's funny because I went back and I sort of interviewed both of my kids and my husband
Mm-hmm.
uh, when I was writing the book. This was just a couple years ago. And I asked them certain things about what they remembered and the takeaways and stuff. And my daughter said, I remember when my friends would come over, initially they were like, "What's wrong with your brother?" And then I went from, thinking he was so annoying because he was making these sounds all the time, to defending him. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
I was 9 or 10 years old, and I'm saying, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And and then I asked Michael, because he doesn't remember the detail that I do. Um, and it's interesting because he said, because I've said that I think that going through this crisis and coming out on the other side has changed us all for the better. I do think that's true. But Michael specifically said, I think he thinks it made him more sort of empathetic
Mm-hmm.
and accepting of other people with all sorts of differences. And it sort of gave him perspective because, he knows what it's like to be ostracized and even bullied.
Mm-hmm.
And, you're not going to treat other people that way.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
the typical child doesn't, I don't think, necessarily have to be,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have to negatively impact
Yes.
him
Yes.
or her.
No. And it's just something, again, to be aware of when,
Definitely.
yes, just something to be aware of. Um, as we're winding down here, I also wanted to bring out, I think this is another Dr. Walk Up famous quote, because the guy is so wise. And this is
Yes.
for everyone who has a child who is maybe seen as having any difference, or different than you maybe thought that he or she or they would be. And he said, the challenge for you is to accept Michael for who he is, and to help him learn to accept himself. And what I think that is sounds so simple, but it is so powerful, is that means for anyone with any sort of label, with any sort of diagnosis, with any sort of quirk, this is about not focusing on those things and those labels and all of the medical aspects. This is to help for us to accept who our child is, and then to ultimately help them accept who they are, Like that's the biggest gift I think we can do, what we can give.
I definitely agree. I think that, but it's very difficult, and it's a process. It didn't happen overnight. Um, Sort of this self acceptance,
Hmm.
but it is very important, and I think, um, gosh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, I think that, one of the things that is really interesting to me is that, and this is true of people who are neurodivergent across the board now, that they're talking more about all of these different differences, right? Not in just in terms of the deficits, but in terms of the benefits,
Hmm.
um, which I think is really, really cool. And I think that there's a guy I quote in the book, A.D. Smith, who's the global Tourette ambassador. He spoke at the Tourette Association Gala in 2022 in New York. And he said, he's British, he said something to the effect of, this is not a deficit, this is a bloody superpower. And I
Hmm.
thought that was so cool that he sort of spinned it that way. And
Hmm.
I think that, in general, you know, when Michael was diagnosed, the word neurodiversity, I don't think was something I
Wasn't.
was aware of. That's
No.
definitely something, right? Isn't that
Yep.
new to the vernacular?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that in general, our society is so much more inclusive in that way
Hmm.
that it just wasn't. So
Hmm.
it makes me hopeful for, all the young people who are being diagnosed with Tourette and other um, diagnoses,
Yes.
that they're not going to be sort of um,
As marginalized.
ostracized, and they're
Yes.
not going to be
Right.
not marginalized. That's the
Right.
word, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because I do think that Tourette is one of those diagnoses that there are still a lot of myths. A lot of people know about. There's a lot of autism awareness. There's a lot of ADHD awareness, but Tourette is still kind of. There are still myths, and there are still misperceptions. And
Mm-hmm.
someone asked me last week when they heard about the book, they were like, "Is he really doing okay?" I'm like, "He's really doing okay. You would
Yeah.
never know."
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's really still people still think that it's mostly cursing. It's only 10% of kids with Tourette syndrome have what they call coprolalia and curse.
Hmm.
So,
Yes, it's often the ones that are shown in the movies, right? As we're always influenced by the media, and
well, and Hollywood has really done a
hmm.
disservice. But I
Hmm.
kind of think, I hope that's changing too.
Hmm. I do think that we are especially in the last decade and more recently, there is much more of an affirming, particularly younger culture, and with the musicians and the athletes and the performers who are speaking out on their depression, their anxiety, their Tourette, their dyslexia, you name it, it really destigmatizes. And I know that social media is, of course, a mixed bag for us as a culture, but having some of these TikTok platforms and these Instagram platforms where people are just talking about their experience and people are sharing, and there is a change. There is a change that is happening where neurodiversity is becoming more affirming, that we are starting to accept different brains for different things and seeing the strength side, while rather than just focused on what's wrong.
Right. Which is really, to me, heartwarming
Hmm.
and exciting.
So, Michelle, what do you want for this? Or what are your hopes for your memoir?
Oh boy. Well, my hope is that it gets into the hands of people who really um, are where I was, back in 2011. People whose child was just diagnosed, or people whose child is ticking and they don't know if it's Tourette or not. Um, you know, and anyone whose child is suffering, I hope that it's educational and inspiring. And I say educational, I had written a strict memoir, and during the various revisions, I ended up adding a fair amount of reporting,
Mm-hmm.
because there really aren't a lot of books out there on
Mm-hmm.
Tourette that are like this. So it's a combination of a memoir what happened to our family, but also I tried to intersperse a lot of facts. So yeah, I hope it gets into the hands of people that it can truly help, and to just know that there's you know that in a lot of cases, kids do end up coming out on the other side and
Yeah.
doing quite well.
Yeah. And I just have to speak to how you blended the personal story, the memoir, with the science and the information and the education. So it truly is for everyone. It's you're going on a ride and on a journey, and you're learning a lot on the way. Besides the human aspects, we're learning about the scientific aspects of the emerging, I will say, still the emerging field of Tourette, and what to know, and what to be aware of on this path when we are in the thick of it with our kids who are struggling.
Well, thank you, and thank you for reading it.
It is time for the parent footprint moment question.
Okay.
Here we go. Tell us about a time that you became aware of yourself as an individual, as a parent, or even an awareness of your own parents, and that new awareness had a positive impact on your life, your kids, and or those you love.
So this was easy because I write in the book how I got married when I was 25 years old. My husband was a medical resident, so he spent 4 years in residency. I was starting out my career as a journalist. We ended up waiting 9 years to have children, and then I had a miscarriage, and then all of a sudden, after really being afraid to have children, so much so that I published an essay in the Washington Post titled "Motherhood Angst" about all of my myriad fears. And I wasn't afraid of childbirth as some women are, because I'm married to an obstetrician. We kind of had that covered. I knew he was going to take care of us. It was
Mm-hmm.
after what would happen when I brought this baby home. I didn't know what to do with it. I hadn't babysat. I was terrified, and it was a rough 9 months. I had a healthy pregnancy, and then Michael was born, and I literally looked at him and I fell in love, and it was nothing that I had expected. It was just this unbelievably wonderful surprise. And then, going on this journey with him was also created an incredible bond that we still have. He's going to be 25, and he he sent me a Mother's Day card last year. And I told him, I said, you never have to send me another Mother's Day card, because I'm just going to keep this in my calendar and read it every year on Mother's Day. But on the front of the card, it said, thanks for helping me grow. And you open it up, and he said, I had my son, my daughter, and my husband all read the book, about a year or so ago before it went to press. And I said, oh, he said in the card, I don't have it with me, but he basically said, after reading the book, I realized how much you had done for me, and I appreciate it so much.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, oh my gosh, every time I look at it, it makes me cry. So it was that, but I think back to the one moment, if you would be,
Mm-hmm.
when he was born.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I have a great bond with my daughter too. Um, but
Yeah.
this book is about him.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Maybe she'll get her own someday, but this is, yes. I love how it is about your whole family and about how they're included in this, and it's written honestly and respectfully. And I can't think of anything better than to have, among the better things in life, to have your child appreciate you for what you've done to help them grow. Like there it is. right? Like,
Mhm.
this is why we're
No,
doing it.
it was very,
Yeah.
yes, it was very heartwarming, and yeah,
Yeah.
it was a heartwarming moment. And
Yeah.
I do think that, it is a challenge also to parent these kids as they get older, because you're so, I was overprotective for obvious reasons,
Hmm.
and sort of letting them go is hard,
Yeah.
but that's
Yes.
another story.
That's another story to be continued.
Yes.
Michele, tell everyone where they can get your book, a little bit more about the conference you're speaking at, and anything else
Mhm.
that you're doing that we should follow.
So the book is coming out on June 4th. It's published by Woodhall Press. It's available wherever books are sold, Amazon Bookshop. You can order it from your local bookstore. You can also order it on woodhallpress.com. My website is micheleturk.com. Michele has one L. And on Instagram at Michele Turk Author, and on Facebook the same. The Tourette Association conference is in June, Dallas, May 31st. I think I'm speaking on June 1st, and my lecture is called If I Knew Then What I Know Now, 20 Lessons Learned from Parenting a Child with Tourette Syndrome.
Nice.
And and after I do that, I am going to try to share snippets of that elsewhere. I don't know if the conference is, I do think they probably make it available online afterwards. And also, you know, far and away, the best resource for parents and people with Tourette syndrome is the Tourette Association of America,
Hmm.
Tourette.org, Tourette.org. There are 21 centers of excellence that are medical facilities, but they also have local chapters that have support groups, and
Hmm.
they do all sorts of things, youth ambassador programs, advocacy programs. So it is a tremendous resource for parents, and it really was for me.
Wonderful. And this show and your book are both going to be coming out during Tourette Awareness Month. So,
That's right.
coincidence or not, people? Okay, good timing.
The book was a coincidence,
Oh, wow.
definitely.
Wow.
It
All
was
right.
supposed to come out in April, and we got delayed. And it turns out it comes out during Tourette Awareness Month, which runs from May 15th to June 15th.
The universe seems to intervene. Thanks, Michele. Wishing you all the best. And once again, just have to say, just so appreciate you putting yourself out there, because that helps all of us step into it in a authentic way and a vulnerable way as well.
Well, thank you. It wasn't easy, but I do think, if you're going to write a memoir, you kind of need to allow people to step into your life a bit, right?
Absolutely.
And thank
Well,
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
all right, everybody. Send this to everyone that you know will benefit. Thank you for being a part of our community, for being so caring. Thank you for your reviews and for rating the show. It really does make a difference. You know what I'm going to ask you to do. Try to be that person you want your child to become, and ask yourself the guiding question: what footprint do you want to leave? This has been a Peters and Rossi production. Parent Footprint with Dr. Dan is produced by Laura Rossi. Our engineer is Phil Rossi. Theme music is Strummer Man, composed and performed by Pro Tunes. Artwork is by Garrett Ross. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Parent Footprint Podcast, and on Twitter at Dr. Dan Peters. For more information, go to exactlyrightmedia.com.